far the most profitable company ever in the world and the highest market value in history. They sell more than $200 billion, I think, or $150 billion of sales in China, and their iPhone is manufactured in China. I hope you know that. Even though it's an American phone, and people will say, I'm going to now stop. I'm boycotting Chinese phone. मैं तो iPhone ही खरीदूंगा. अरे भैया iPhone भी China नहीं खरीदना. So he said, Mr. Tim Cook said that I am in China not for cheap labor. I am not there in China for the cheap labor. I am there in China because I cannot find a talent outside China. So this is the reality you must understand when we say China challenge. That this is the Chinese. 20 years ago, if you look at the top 15 ranked universities in the world, this is Stanford, Harvard, MIT, there is hardly one Chinese name. Today, 5 out of 20 are Chinese universities. Tsinghua, Beijing University. So they are not just, even educational standards, and these rankings are international rankings. They are based on publications and research. They are one up. So we have to understand that the China challenge means it is mostly our domestic agenda. We have to sustain high economic growth. We have to sustain, industrial policy which increases the share of manufacturing in our GDP. It is stuck. I often like to ask this question to students. India had economic reforms in '91. We opened up the industrial sector, de-licensing gap, license raj khatam hua. कोई भी आके industry set up कीजिए. 30 साल के बाद, so in 1991, our manufacturing to GDP ratio was 16%. So 30 साल के बाद क्या होगा भैया? What do you think is the answer?
Same.
16%. Exactly. So therefore that is our domestic agenda. Rising to the China challenge means how do we increase the share of manufacturing to GDP? How do we actually play to our strengths? So we have to have, instead of, in the earlier years of development, we focus on capital intensive import substitution strategy. But labor, our biggest resource is labor. Our most fantastic success story is the IT industry. 30% of India's market cap comes from IT, or related to IT. So we have to, and IT exports are at 200 billion. So we have to, India is the #1 remittance economy. Matlab 87 or 90 billion dollars come back to India from remittances, from workers in the Middle East, etc. That's like labor export, right? So the world is aging. So there is a shortage of nurses or paramedical staff. India exports nurses. We यहाँ पे कम पड़ते हैं. So I'm saying we have to find a way to play to our advantage. We have to find a way to increase. So the only long-term strategy is for India to have sustained and inclusive, strong growth, which is much more industrial in nature. And of course, relatedly, we have to try and reduce the China dependency. We also have to build some opportunistic alliances, because I'll just conclude now because I've taken much longer than I thought. We have to build opportunistic alliances on the geopolitics of it. So for example, we have the Quad Alliance and we are doing some other things. But we have to do the other geopolitics, but mainly our agenda is economic. And I think as exporting country, this year we achieved $420 billion of exports, but our trade deficit is also all-time high at $200 billion. So when we export out of India, not just IT, software, but also merchandise like textiles, we should be the #1 textile export in the world, because the China has vacated that space, but it's gone to Vietnam, it's gone to Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is in the bad shape now. It's gone to Bangladesh. So why can't India claim that position of being a garment exporter, big time? So we need to have policies which promote. Until recently, a second shift was not allowed. Women were not, in Bangalore, women were not allowed to work second shift. So Bangladesh, which is an Islamic nation, had 3 shifts. 90% of Bangladesh garment industry is dominated by women, and they work in 3 shifts. Bangalore में allow नहीं करते हैं अभी भी. मेरा अभी शायद हो गया. But I'm saying, so there are a lot of these kind of reforms that we need to do. But I'll conclude by saying, see, meeting the Chinese challenge has geopolitics in it and has economic strategy in it. Economic strategy is simply domestic agenda. It's not outward looking, it is our own house we have to fix. But I want to conclude by saying, don't think that China is all that, completely invincible. So I want to conclude by pointing out to you that there are weaknesses developing in the Chinese economic system. Number 1, aging. It is a rapidly aging society, and on a scale of 1.4 billion population. That's why they have hastily abandoned one-child policy. Abhi to bolte 2 children, 3 children, 3 child. They want people to produce 3 children. It's not that easy. So because of aging, there is also decline in productivity. So productivity is declining in China. Thirdly, there is a huge amount of debt. See, to keep the legitimacy, 30% of Chinese GDP comes from real estate sector. Everybody invests in real estate. But now the debt to GDP ratio, including housing debt, is so large. You must have heard of Evergrande. There was a real estate, almost collapsed, like the Lehman collapse. So the debt is going to crush China. Other countries are also suffering from that. The debt is something not easy to solve for the Chinese. Fourthly, they have taken pangas with everybody at the same time. Philippines के साथ पंगा है, Japanese के साथ पंगा है, India के साथ पंगा है, America में तो है ही saber rattling. So they seem to have become belligerent on multiple fronts. That's never. They are not welcoming even Sri Lanka, where they poured a lot of money. African nations में कितना सारा debt diplomacy किया, but the people are actually resistant and hostile to the Chinese. They don't want to welcome Chinese debt. So I'm saying that on international relations, they are also on a weaker wicket. Then two more points. So second last point is that they have become hostile to their own private sector, like Alibaba, Tencent, even these companies. Jack Ma, who was a star entrepreneur, is just completely invisible. पता नहीं जेल में या कहाँ पे है. So the Chinese government put, it was supposed to be the biggest IPO in the world. This Alibaba. Just 2 days before that they withdrew it. I mean they put it, they forced it to New York Stock Exchange में list होने वाला था. So this is the assertion of the Chinese Communist Party. But the Chinese Communist Party, they take on their own private sector, which are giants. ZTE है, Huawei है, फिर Xiaomi है, then Alibaba. If you are going to be hostile to your private sector, which has created so much value, then that's not a good thing. That is, I think that's going to create weakness. And lastly, if you see what happened in Hong Kong, because this student-led agitation for more freedom. See, in the age of social media, you can only have so much suppression. They have been managed to, the old days are gone, where you can suppress news coming out. But social media में बहुत ही different है. It's not possible. So I think these are the points of vulnerabilities of the Chinese, and therefore we should not take this challenge as if keep pushing on. I think there's lots that next 10 years will be transformative in this relation. But I think India has a lot to do on its domestic front as well. So, but I want to also I want to conclude with one more line. I feel that India and China together is like what one third of humanity. 40% of humanity is just these two countries. दोनों मिला के 38-39% of world population. So there is something called government to government relations. Then there is people to people also. So people to people should not be a hostage to the government to government. Because government एक दूसरे के साथ लड़ाई करे. लेकिन people of China are different from government of China. The Communist Party, by the way, has 91 million members. It is the second largest political party in the world. Guess which is the number one? आपको पता है. But 91 million, that is only 1/10 of the country. 1/10 नहीं, 1/12. So the country, so people to people contact नहीं भूले हम लोग. I think so we have to invest more in Chinese scholarship of the economy, of its society, of its culture. We have to promote Chinese tourism. The Chinese are the number one tourists in the world. 137 million Chinese go outside China. Guess how many come to India? 50,000. We know this number because it is the visas are issued in Shanghai and Beijing embassy. आपको पता है? अरे 50,000. Why can't even 1% of Chinese tourists come to India? At least 1 million तो आए. हर एक टूरिस्ट $2,000 स्पेंड करेगा. So 1 million, 2 billion dollars को फॉरेन एक्सचेंज मिलेगा. You customize it Buddhist circuit कीजिए उनको गया प्रयाग. So I think let's not give up that there is still a lot to this relationship which can be positive, productive, and mutually beneficial. I'm not saying we turn a blind eye to what is happening under Xi Jinping, but I think there is enough scope for this to go on. So on that count, let me conclude my speech here and thank you again for inviting me. Thank you. Japan had invaded, I don't know if you remember the horrible stories of the rape of Nanjing. The Nanjing में जो massacre हुआ Japanese. So the Japanese were the Japanese colonial ambitions meant that they were they had invaded China, and so there was this war with Japan, and at the same time there was a civil war between the Kuomintang, which was kind of the right-wing party, they call it, and the Communist Party, which was founded by the intellectuals. So there was all this tension. एक तो कभी ये Kuomintang and Communist Party, they used to get together and fight the Japanese. कभी they used to fight each other, and this continued from 1920s all the way to 1949. So the China actually suffered almost 30 years of civil war. This was a civil war internally between the Kuomintang and Chinese Communist Party. And there was this great one period in 1934-35, which was a great withdrawal. What is it called? The Long March. Those of you who have read the biography of Mao, because now comes this new figure, or this person who rises to the top, called Mao Zedong, or Mao Zedong, they call it. 1934-35, there was a retreat. It's called the Long March. It was a very punishing, very full of hardships. A lot of people died because they had to retreat. They were losing. But eventually, these people came back. At that time, it was called the Red Army. And there was this young officer then who slowly started taking control. That person's name was Mao Zedong. And because of Kuomintang, there was corruption and there was internal dissent and so on. So ultimately, these people were able to drive out the Kuomintang. So now what we call Taiwan today is where the Kuomintang went, and so it was driven out, and finally China declared itself as a republic, independent nation in 1949. They drove out the Japanese. Just like people have to remember that in the Second World War, the largest sacrifices and the largest contribution was actually done by the Soviet Union against Hitler. Similarly, the huge pushback given to the Japanese. Remember, the Japanese were invading. They had come to Burma, they were coming to Calcutta, they had come to Singapore. The Japanese also had very strong ambitions. Ultimately, the nuclear bomb actually put a this thing to that. So, but people also have to remember that the Chinese contribution to the pushback to the Japanese is also important on this side. So finally, and Mao became the supreme leader. And the Mao era was not, I told you, it started in 1934-35 when he was just an officer of the Red Army. But he took control, he consolidated the army. This was the Long March, so some retreat over there. They all went into the rural areas of China. They had to, because they were facing defeat. At one time they thought the Chinese party will be annihilated. Itni buri unki halat thi. But they came back, and this young officer rose to become the general, and he became, as you know, Chairman Mao. So he took control of the party, he took control of the state as president of, I guess, and then also of the military. That was 1949. And the Mao era went all the way to 1976. And it was a very poor country, by the way. Just like India. India was also poor and illiterate. China also was poor and illiterate. Newly independent nation. The per capita income in China was lower than India actually. And at least India had this great experiment. The many development economists in the world were excited. This new country called India, the planning model, Marl Lopez, Mr. Nehru, and I'm sure Raj Krishna was also part of that early excitement. Who's who of the development economics world came to India, including, believe it or not, Milton Friedman. I don't know, Professor Kanta, Milton Friedman came to India in 1956. So there was this India which was a great promise, but China was a backward comparatively. I don't think people went to China with as much excitement. And anyway, because Mao had decidedly turned, and this was the failure of the Cold War. If there's one thing that the Americans hated, it was the communists. So they were extremely apprehensive and worried about the spread of communism. So there was not that much excitement among the Western scholars to go to China and rebuild that nation, but certainly in India. So 1949 to 1976 was the Mao era, and there were several disasters. I don't want to recount the entire history, but the two major disasters, one was the Great Leap Forward and the other was the Cultural Revolution, where it is said tens of millions of people died of famine. So Mr. Amartya Sen, the famous Nobel laureate from India, has said that in a democracy, famines will not lead to deaths. That was his big thesis, because in a democracy, the press, the freedom of the press, will ensure that the information about distress will get spread. And because of information, so the resources will rush towards the distressed areas. And I think there is some validity to this, that India has not seen those kind of famine deaths. We have the famine of 1943 before our independence in Bengal, and it is claimed and also now I think substantially proved that famine was caused by Churchill. I would recommend a book by a scholar, I think Mrs. Mukherjee, I forget her name, Bengali lady, who was very solidly and very painstakingly documented the connection of the 1943 famine, which led to perhaps more than 1 million or 2 million deaths, and the policies of Churchill, where deliberately food grain was denied to the Indian public so that the British troops, it was taken away from India. But that was different. But India has not seen famine deaths of the kind China saw. China saw starvation deaths of tens of millions of people because of some crazy, now we can call it that Maoist policies. But this era, Mao era, went all the way to 1976. There was, who knows how much growth, I'm sure the World Bank and the IMF are keeping track, but those growth numbers were not reliable. And I think if Raj Krishna called it the Hindu rate of growth, I don't know what you would have called China. It was Han rate of growth or something, because it was almost stagnant. Yet, the great wily statesman or minister or foreign minister called Henry Kissinger and his boss Richard Nixon, right-wing president in USA, as right-wing as they come, like President Trump or something like that, they decided that they were going to go to China. So very secretly, a plane aaya Karachi, I think they landed in, not Karachi, Lahore or something. Nobody knew, and suddenly there was planned that Mr. Nixon, the president of USA, would go to China, 71. And 71, India had a genocide happening next to us. In East Pakistan, there was genocide, rape and murder of people. And India was just standing by, kya ho raha hai? And the US and the UN, there was just silent. I mean, of course, the Europeans had started saying, so finally India decided to send our troops inside. And the great Mr. Kissinger and Mr. Nixon, kya gali mile India ko? They said, you are sacrificing the sovereignty of another nation. How can you invade vis-a-vis Russia is invading Ukraine? They equated the villainy of India with that. They were not worried about the fact that there was genocide and murder of citizens happening in East Pakistan, but they were more worried or criticizing India's sending troops. इधर वहाँ Chinese के साथ friendship हो रही है. यहाँ पे they sent the 7th fleet, the US Navy sent the 7th fleet to the Bay of Bengal, and thanks to Russia's help and thanks to our Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, we were able to kind of hold our ground. And you know what happened? The independence of Bangladesh, the liberation of Bangladesh, and India withdrew after that. We didn't capture territory. So I'm saying around that same time, this thing was going on, this friendship to China. And the most unlikely, because the Republicans, the right wing of the United System political spectrum, was actually much more anti-communist than the liberals. In general, America was very fiercely anti-communist, but if anything, the right wing was extremely, and they were the most unlikely people to reach out to communist China, but they did. And uske baad headline ekdam badal gaye. China is a great nation, it is an ancient civilization, it is so rich in culture and scholarship and and so on and so forth. So you will see the change in the American tone. Because why did they do it? Because they thought that is the way to counter the weight of USSR, Soviet Union. That was the strategy. So Mr. Mao died in 1976, and he had during the 1934-35 the Great Retreat, as I mentioned, unka ek lieutenant hua karta tha, who also was a military leader. His name was Deng Xiaoping. So then Xiaoping then slowly rose to power. And it's amazing that just, we talk about Mao, and now we of course we want to talk about Xi Jinping. Mr. Deng Xiaoping did not hold any office. It's like Jaipur Narayan in our movement which happened in 1978. He was not the prime minister, he was not president of China, he was not premier of China, he didn't hold any high office, and he was the most powerful. This is the Deng Xiaoping era, and he is the one who transformed, just an outstanding transformation of the Chinese economy. From 1978, the economic reform started, and in the next 40 years or so, 1980 to 2020, or 1978 to 2018, they actually celebrated, just like we celebrated last year, our 30th anniversary of economic reforms of India, which we dated at 1991. They dated at 1978. 78 to 2018, in 40 years, per capita income went up by 70 times. 70. Today, China is the second largest economy in dollar terms. And in PPP terms, purchasing power parity terms, it is actually bigger than America already today, not 10 years from now. $15 trillion is its size. Per capita income up by 70 times, 70 times in 40 years. National GDP in real terms is 10 times bigger. It is an export juggernaut, exporting juggernaut. The entire strategy of the Deng Xiaoping era was they believed that the only way it's not a democratic country by conventional definition. But the Communist Party is 100 years old. How does it stay one party rule? Kaise hota hai? So the legitimacy that the Communist Party gets is from job growth and income growth and GDP growth and industrial growth. So GDP growth consistently has been 10% for 30 years out of those 40. Real GDP, not nominal GDP, net of inflation. And basically they were able to take some 300 to 400 million people from the rural areas into urban areas and into industrial clusters. See, I want to say why China is a challenge, because the topic is how do we rise to this challenge? You have to see the transformation of the economic transformation of China. That they have managed to take 300 to 400 million people out of poverty, out of rural areas, in decent jobs, in industrial zones. The per capita incomes have gone up. GDP has been consistently at 10%, now it is at 8 or 7%, and the investment to GDP ratio was as high as 50%. Our investment to GDP ratio in India is about 30 or 29, 28% now. During 2007-8, we peaked at 36, 37%, but we are down to 29 now. China has consistently been 50%. Thoda kam ho gaya, 45 hua. So basically, if you're just, what is investment? Investment is nothing but tomorrow's growth. When you invest more, you get more growth tomorrow. So consistently, the hugely, if you look at it from a sort of a lens of, if you look at national income and divide it into two kind of claimants to that income, labor and capital. This is not Marxist economics. I'm just saying pura GDP is nothing but national income. It goes to two classes. It goes to labor, it goes to capital. So if you say the same thing in a Chinese context, I'm saying that this entire GDP is growing at 10%. Okay? Some of it is going to labor, some of it is going to capital. Guess what was the rate of growth of GDP was 10%. What was the rate of growth of wages, real wages of workers in China during those 30 years? Answer, 0. Real wages were increasing at 0. So therefore, workers were getting jobs from 0 productivity in rural areas to some positive productivity in urban areas, in the special economic zones, industrial clusters. But the wage growth of industrial workers in China was nearly 0 for a long time. Yes, it is ho sakta hai, because they were getting livelihoods. They were becoming economically independent. So bulk of the national GDP was going, the profitability was actually being enjoyed by capital. But the capital was owned by PSUs, public sector units. It was all, dominated by public sector. So the entire profits of the public sector were being replowed as investment. That's why the investment to GDP ratio was high. That was the strategy. Growth was basically fueled by, and because wage rates were kind of stagnant, therefore, not surprisingly, the consumption to GDP growth ratio of China is even today at around 37-40%. It was for a long time just 33%. India's ratio, with a much lower income, our consumption to GDP ratio is something like 67%, I think, 65-68%. So we are double of China, even though our incomes are much lower, because we are a consumer-led economy. But China को दबाया गया ना. Worker, the people who lost out with the 110 million workers, because if only their wages had risen faster, you would have more richer people in China. But the Chinese are anyway happy because their incomes are much higher. Even their so-called slow growth of wage rate, even then their per capita income is 4 or 5 times than India. India का अभी $2,000 है, उनका already $8,000, 3-4 times. And the other strategy that the Chinese used was that this entire thing, growth was fueled by export-led growth. The whole kahani is based on export-led growth. So how did they do that? Well, it all started with Nixon and Kissinger, right? उसके बाद तो West was just whining and dining China. कि आओ we are. So then, you know what happened in the Deng Xiaoping era? He said he welcomed the American and European investors. Come and set up FDI here. Come and set up your factories here. Red carpet treatment. People forget, 1978 is the beginning of the Deng Xiaoping era. Just 11 years later, 1989 June में क्या हुआ? 4th of June, the Tiananmen massacre. We don't even remember that now. Actually, the Western observers were seeing कि under Deng Xiaoping economic freedom बढ़ रहा है, शायद political reform हो रहा है, some internal student protest हो रहे हैं. So the West was thinking कि when economic prosperity will come to China, it will follow, political reforms will follow, it will become a democracy. But ऐसा कुछ नहीं था. Actually, the Tiananmen massacre just showed that they actually just crushed the movement, student movement. It was not really a movement for political freedom. It was actually a intra-party fight, and the West has forgotten it. They misread the whole thing. And 89 June में ये हुआ, लेकिन 89 November में the Berlin Wall fell. So East and West Germany became one. The Soviet Union fell. So the entire Western media was consumed by the Berlin Wall. So we forgot about what happened in China. And then of course China went back to being the lesson of 1989 was this was still the Deng Xiaoping era. He was still the champion of economic reforms. But the party is supreme. The party is the boss. The Communist Party is the boss. बाकी सब कुछ हम करेंगे, we'll do economic reforms, but without threatening the political supremacy of the Communist Party of China. So that was the lesson from. And then what happened is that so it was export-led growth. So basically the Western companies were going in big growth. In the last 30 years, the amount of Western investment that has gone into China is $2.7 trillion. $2.7 trillion. By comparison, India has got in the last 30 years about 600 or 650. So हमारे 4 गुना. And these are all in the special economic zone. This set up large. We have also learned from them. See, we are actually, I can say it in a lighter way, please don't get me wrong. हम लोग चाइना को अभी 2 साल से काफी we are very angry and गाली भी देते हैं, but secretly we admire them. I suspect a lot of people see SEZ policies also we have borrowed from them. Many things we think scale करना चाहिए, supply chain होना चाहिए, export-led growth. These are all the ideas that China practiced. China practiced it for 3 or 4 decades. The strategy was export-led growth, which means that you keep wages low. I told you, you keep the exchange rate low, artificially suppressed. So actually, the people who suffer are the people of China because for them foreign goods are always going to be expensive. अगर आपका exchange rate, so much dollars are going into China, yet their exchange rate is not appreciating. It is kept depressed. But that undervalued currency and liberal policies on SEZ and export focus, relentless focus on exports, that is the secret. That carried on for 3 decades. And other countries are also, of course, the Chinese learned it from the Japanese, उसके बाद Koreans, the Malaysians, the Thai, all the East Asian miracle countries, they followed the same template. I don't think it is possible for India to follow it in the same scale now because the world is different. But that was going on in China. I must tell you that when it came to India-China, India in 2001, India was destination number 19 in Chinese exports. So India the rank, it was the 19th most important country for the Chinese exporters. By 2000, that was 2001. By 2015, we were number 6 already. So India's growth during the 2004 onwards, growth hua hamara, that started becoming very important to the Chinese. So they started paying attention to India also as an export. I'm sure in this room, everybody has a mobile phone. I won't be surprised if more than half or 3/4 of the phones are made where, or majority, even though they might be assembled in India. So India's importance to China also increased. And if you in 2020, so basically in 1988, so Deng Xiaoping started in 78. In 1988 December, Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, he went to China. First head of state, first Prime Minister to go after the 1962 India-China war. Why? He said कि हम लोग पड़ोसी हैं, and we have border issues. We have never settled the border. It's from British times. तो अभी पाकिस्तान के साथ भी नहीं हुआ. तो वो उन्होंने कहा कि let us keep the border issue, उसको हम सुलझाएंगे, but let us pursue on other grounds, in other dimensions like trade, commerce, investment, even cultural ties. So that was his historic visit to China. It was 1988, 1989 में Tiananmen हुआ, but 88 में, and then progressively we signed many agreements with the Chinese. देखिए गर्मा गर्मी होगी, मतलब बॉर्डर पे एक दूसरे को घूर घूर के देखते हैं सोल्जर्स, लेकिन बंदूक भी चलनी चाहिए. Secondly, no troop build-up should happen. So we signed many such agreements. Unfortunately, in 2020, in May, first of all, in Doklam is not part of India; it is part of another country called Bhutan. 70 days तक चला, उनके बहुत सारे troops आए, कुछ road buildings हुआ, तो India objected, and very patiently we were able to defuse that situation. That was 2017. But in 2020, in the month of April, May, June, 50,000 Chinese troops came. And I don't know why, that was the period of COVID. So whatever reason, 20 soldiers died. मतलब जो नहीं होना चाहिए था, 50-40 साल नहीं हुआ कि there was गर्मा गर्मी, and we had a mechanism to defuse the situation by escalating from the border to the army generals to Delhi to phone call, Beijing, कुछ ना कुछ करके भी तरीका था. But in June 2020, we were not able to prevent casualties. And I believe there is a decisive change now. So I used to think that for many years we were able to pursue bilateral relations by keeping our trade, commerce, investment and cultural relationship in a separate compartment, and border issues like in Ladakh or wherever, Arunachal, in a separate. तो वो भी pursue करते रहो diplomacy के through, और इसको भी pursue करते रहो. That's why bilateral trade वगैरह हो रहा है. In 2020, when this incident happened, and this I think is the change. So Deng Xiaoping, of course, that era ended. उसके बाद 2-3 presidents हुए, Hu Jintao हुए, फिर Wen Jiabao, but really Jiang Zemin. So after Deng Xiaoping was not president, by the way. As I told you, he didn't hold any office, but Jiang Zemin era happened. Then Hu Jintao, and उसके बाद एक नए हस्ती आए, the new guy, new boss came. His name is Xi Jinping. So the Xi Jinping era is the third. So there is the Mao era, there is the Deng Xiaoping era, and now there is the Xi Jinping era, which is back to Mao. So whatever economic reforms or some party reforms that Deng Xiaoping had introduced, I think Mr. Xi Jinping is back to complete control. He is the head of the military, he is head of the party, he is head of the country. All three major things he heads, and he is much more aggressive. The Deng Xiaoping का एक paradigm था, philosophy की lie low, bide your time, or cross the river by feeling the stones. I don't know if you heard his famous 10 aphorisms. So वो सब अभी abandoned हो गया. It is much more belligerent, much more aggressive, and lots of change. So the Xi Jinping era, under the name of anti-corruption, he has arrested so many of his political rivals. He is going to be, there was supposed to be term limits. Deng Xiaoping said that nobody can be president for more than 2 terms. 5 साल, उसके बाद नहीं. That also may be sacrificed, that principle. So I think there is a decisive change, and that is what I mean by the China challenge. That all these years, I told you in 2001, India-China trade was $1 billion bilateral trade. By 2015, it was 100 billion. 100 times growth in 14 years. Of course, it was asymmetry. There were much more imports from China into India than India's exports to. But thankfully, from 16, 17, 17, 18, 18, 19, before Galwan happened, before the Ladakh incident happened, India's exports to China were actually increasing. Because that bilateral trade deficit was come karna hai, this was agreed on by both sides. But now things are different. Unfortunately now, so what does this Chinese challenge mean? Basically, I feel that we are in a different era. Even in 2020, when this thing was happening, India's #1 trading partner was China. Even in 2020. ठीक है, 2021, that is in May we banned all the Chinese apps. In March we said no Chinese FDI allowed. Then we made it difficult for other investments to come in. So 2021, #1 trading partner of India, China. And 21 is 20% more than 20. 2022 में वही हालत है. So it is very difficult. So that's the China challenge. How do we extricate ourselves this Chinese dependency? So I mean, rising to the China challenge, according to me, will be it's a very difficult task, because I believe that unless it's a domestic agenda, it's not like defeating China in some international competition. Our icon lady, she goes and it's not like defeating them in badminton. It is actually, it's a domestic agenda. Meaning we have to, our economy has to get stronger. Our China dependency has to progressively go low. We cannot decrease our dependency overnight, because, for example, even critical sectors like healthcare, यहाँ पे penicillin नहीं बनता है, paracetamol नहीं बनता है. You have to import the key APIs, advanced pharmaceutical intermediates. 60%, 68% of our APIs come from China. Even like, when you use a washing machine, जो front loading होता है, उसका compressor भी China से आता है. Air conditioning. Till recently we had to import compressors from China. So, in fact, during COVID, you used to press this, वो दवा के वो sanitizer लगाते थे. So, जो pump करने का जो plastic है, that has 16 moving parts. There was nobody in India producing it. It had to be imported from China. And why can't we do this? I don't know. Why are we not able to? Escalators, wheelchairs, you name it. Not just mobile phone. Mobile phone तो आपको सबको पता है. If you can't afford an iPhone, you go to Xiaomi. Xiaomi का बड़ा एक ad चल रहा है. But by the way, even iPhone, Mr. Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, American chief executive of Apple, is by far the most profitable company ever in the world and the highest market value in history. They sell more than $200 billion, I think, or $150 billion of sales in China, and their iPhone is manufactured in China. I hope you know that. Even though it's an American phone, and people will say, I'm going to now stop. I'm boycotting Chinese phone. तो iPhone ही खरीदूंगा. अरे भैया iPhone भी China नहीं खरीदना. So he said, Mr. Tim Cook said that I am in China not for cheap labor. I am not there in China for the cheap labor. I am there in China because I cannot find a talent outside China. So this is the reality you must understand when we say China challenge. That this is the Chinese. 20 years ago, if you look at the top 15 ranked universities in the world, this is Stanford, Harvard, MIT, there is hardly one Chinese name. Today, 5 out of 20 are Chinese universities. Tsinghua, Beijing University. So they are not just, even educational standards, and these rankings are international rankings. They are based on publications and research. They are one up. So we have to understand that the China challenge means it is mostly our domestic agenda. We have to sustain high economic growth. We have to sustain, industrial policy which increases the share of manufacturing in our GDP. It is stuck. I often like to ask this question to students. India had economic reforms in 91. We opened up the industrial sector, delicensing गया, license राज खत्म हुआ. कोई भी आके industry set up कीजिए. 30 30 साल के बाद, so in 1991 our manufacturing to GDP ratio was 16%. So 30 साल के बाद क्या होगा भैया? What do you think is the answer?
Same.
16%. Exactly. So so therefore that is our domestic agenda. Rising to the China challenge means how do we increase the share of manufacturing to GDP? How do we actually play to our strengths? So we have to have, instead of, in the early areas of development, we focus on capital intensive import substitution strategy. But labor, our biggest resource is labor. Our most fantastic success story is the IT industry. 30% of India's market cap comes from IT, or related to IT. So we have to, and IT exports are at 200 billion. So we have to, India is the number one remittance economy. Matlab 87 or 90 billion dollars come back to India from remittances, from workers in the Middle East, etc. That's like labor export, right? So the world is aging. So there is a shortage of nurses or paramedical staff. India exports nurses. We यहाँ पे कम पड़ते हैं. So I'm saying we have to find a way to play to our advantage. We have to find a way to increase. So the only long-term strategy is for India to have sustained and inclusive, strong growth, which is much more industrial in nature. And of course, relatedly, we have to try and reduce the China dependency. We also have to build some opportunistic alliances, because I'll just conclude now because I've taken much longer than I thought. We have to build opportunistic alliances on the geopolitics of it. So for example, we have the Quad Alliance and we are doing some other things. But we have to do those other geopolitical things, but mainly our agenda is economic. And I think as exporting country, this year we achieved $420 billion of exports, but our trade deficit is also all-time high at 200 billion. So when we export out of India, not just IT software, but also merchandise like textiles, we should be the number one textile export in the world, because the China has vacated that space, but it's gone to Vietnam, it's gone to Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is in the bad shape now. It's gone to Bangladesh. So why can't India claim that position of being a garment exporter, big time? So we need to have policies which promote. Until recently, a second shift was not allowed. Women were not, in Bangalore, women were not allowed to work second shift. So Bangladesh, which is an Islamic nation, had 3 shifts. 90% of Bangladesh garment industry is dominated by women, and they work in 3 shifts. Bangalore में allow नहीं करते हैं अभी भी. मेरा अभी शायद हो गया. But I'm saying, so there are a lot of these kind of reforms that we need to do. But I'll conclude by saying, see, meeting the Chinese challenge has geopolitics in it and has economic strategy in it. Economic strategy is simply domestic agenda. It's not outward looking, it is our own house we have to fix. But I want to conclude by saying, don't think that China is all that, completely invincible. So I want to conclude by pointing out to you that there are weaknesses developing in the Chinese economic system. Number one, aging. It is a rapidly aging society, and on a scale of 1.4 billion population. That's why they have hastily abandoned one-child policy. अभी तो बोलते हैं 2 children, 3 children, 3 child. They want people to produce 3 children. वो नहीं होने वाला, it's not that easy. So because of aging, there is also decline in productivity. So productivity is declining in China. Thirdly, there is a huge amount of debt. See, to keep the legitimacy, 30% of Chinese GDP comes from real estate sector. Everybody invests in real estate. But now the debt to GDP ratio, including housing debt, is so large. You must have heard of Evergrande. There was a real estate, almost collapsed, like the Lehman collapse. So the debt is going to crush China. Other countries are also suffering from, but the debt is something not easy to solve for the Chinese. Fourthly, they have taken pangas with everybody at the same time. फिलीपींस के साथ पंगा है, जापानीज के साथ पंगा है, इंडिया के साथ पंगा है, अमेरिका में तो है ही saber rattling. So they seem to have become belligerent on multiple fronts. That's never. They are not welcoming even Sri Lanka, where they poured a lot of money. African nations में कितना सारा debt diplomacy किया, but the people are actually resistant and hostile to the Chinese. They don't want to welcome Chinese debt. So I'm saying that on international relations, they are also on a weaker wicket. Then 2 more points. Second last point is that they have become hostile to their own private sector, like Alibaba, Tencent, even these companies. Jack Ma, who was a star entrepreneur, is just completely invisible. पता नहीं जेल में या कहाँ पे है. So the Chinese government it was supposed to be the biggest IPO in the world. This Alibaba. just 2 days before that they withdrew it. I mean, they forced it to, New York Stock Exchange में list होने वाला था. So this is the assertion of the Chinese Communist Party. But the Chinese Communist Party, they take on their own private sector, which are giants, ZTE है, Huawei है, फिर Xiaomi है, then Alibaba. If you are going to be hostile to your private sector, which has created so much value, then that's not a good thing. That is, I think that's going to create weakness. And lastly, if you see what happened in Hong Kong, because this student-led agitation for more freedom. See, in the age of social media, you can only have so much suppression. They have been managed to, the old days are gone, where you can suppress news coming out. But social media में बहुत ही different है. It's not possible. So I think these are the points of vulnerabilities of the Chinese, and therefore we should not take this challenge as if keep pushing on. I think there's lots that next 10 years will be transformative in this relation. But I think India has a lot to do on its domestic front as well. So, but I want to also have I want to conclude with one more line. I feel that India and China together is like what one third of humanity. 40% of humanity is just these two countries. दोनों मिला के 38-39% of world population. So there is something called government to government relations. Then there is people to people also. So people to people should not be a hostage to the government to government. Because government एक दूसरे के साथ लड़ाई करे. लेकिन people of China are different from government of China. The Communist Party, by the way, has 91 million members. It is the second largest political party in the world. Guess which is number one? आपको पता है. But 91 million, that is only 1/10 of the country. 1/10 नहीं, 1/12. So the country, so people to people contact नहीं भूले हम लोग. I think so we have to invest more in Chinese scholarship of the economy, of its society, of its culture. We have to promote Chinese tourism. The Chinese are the number one tourists in the world. 137 million Chinese go outside China. Guess how many come to India? 50,000. We know this number because it is the visas are issued in Shanghai and Beijing embassy. हमको पता है. अरे 50,000. Why can't even 1% of Chinese tourists come to India? At least 1 million तो आए. हर एक टूरिस्ट $2,000 स्पेंड करेगा. So 1 million, 2 billion dollars को फॉरेन एक्सचेंज मिलेगा. You customize it Buddhist circuit कीजिए उनको गया प्रयाग. So I think let's not give up that there is still a lot to this relationship which can be positive, productive, and mutually beneficial. I'm not saying we turn a blind eye to what is happening under Xi Jinping, but I think there is enough scope for this to go on. So on that count, let me conclude my speech here and thank you again for inviting me. Thank you.
I'm sure all of us are inspired with your optimistic perspective towards challenges. And by talking about the historical transformation, you turned this lecture into a story. And as it is said, the best way to understand a topic is with a story. You educated us about the various economic and political strategies that China follow, which put light on the actual challenge. And you also told us about the meaning of the China challenge, which is to extricate ourselves from Chinese dependency. Along with this, you also enlightened us about where the solution lies. You ended your lecture with talking about the relationship which Indian people can have with Chinese, which resembles a lot with the slogan given by Jawaharlal Nehru, Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai. So with this, it's time to make the session more interactive. Audience can now put up their questions to Dr. Ranade. Please make sure to keep the questions precise, as we will have to end this Q&A session in not more than 15 minutes.
Your entire deliberation was very provocative. Provocative in the sense that we could understand so many things. Now, my question is a little bit different on the basis of the project situation. There is an organized attack on Rus by the Western and European forces on the name of NATO, expansion of NATO. Now they have created the problem that the Rus was compelled to retaliate. Similarly, on the other side, the Western world, India and other parts of rising economy they have come together and started approaching China. Now, like organizations like what, whenever there is an interaction between America and India, or between other countries or European world and India, they always pose a threat to China. In this kind of politics, China is, I think, forced to have retaliation. And now retaliation is some kind of different kind, which is not associated with the retaliation like this. Now, in this kind of political situation, or rather in this kind of dynamic political economy, what will you suggest so that India and China, they can get the life friendship in the field of economy, in the field of culture, in the field of religion, or even in the field of so many personalities like certain ancient personalities in India and Confucius in China. Now, if this kind of scenario appears, then probably the global order can undergo the process of a very rapid transformation. So what kind of suggestion you will make in this kind of dynamic political situations?
I'll give my answer very little understanding. So more scholarship about, see, when the Chinese delegation comes here, they bring their own translators. So we can't even find Indians who can speak Chinese to translate us again. So that means our scholarship, I hope your university has China department, Chinese language department, has been here. पूरे बॉम्बे यूनिवर्सिटी में बहुत मुश्किल से 2-3 लोग मिलते हैं. So I'm saying our scholarship of China, their culture, their history, their language is so poor. Whereas you look at Americans, how much they study China. Of course, they are richer than us. So I'm saying that was not a mandate. We have to understand our scholarship has to give. But as far as his question is concerned, see, actually, even in the height of Mr. Trump's presidency, the China-USA trade was $650 billion. I'm not going to 120 billion. So, for all the saber rattling and all, basically the trade linkage is very strong. So, as you rightly said, this new challenge is, it's not about nuclear war or patent tax and troops. It's about the US is concerned about the fact that the Chinese dominance in 5G, artificial intelligence, electric cars, and robotics, it's overtaking. Huawei के CFO को arrest किया हुआ है वहाँ पे Canada. So there, it's really the fear, anxiety is about Chinese dominance of tech. So what we are seeing is a tech cold war. If you go to China, you can't use Google, you can't use YouTube, you can't use Twitter, you can't use Gmail, because it's bad. So the whole world is divided into two spheres. We take this for granted. So really that is the war that cyber in the field of what I call the tech cold war, and that's where we have to choose our allies carefully. Of course, we won't go into the Chinese camp, but we have to understand this is about tech dominance also. And I think one can go on and on about this thing. But a lot of it is domesticated now. We have to develop our own cyber security. लोग कहते हैं कि they can hack our electricity system, they can hack our airline booking system. So our capabilities on cyber security should be much higher. Our capability on security, financial banking and all. So that is where our action is needed. But at the same time, I think we should increase the Chinese scholarship. That is, India's universities, especially investing more in understanding China.
50,000 Chinese students come here, come out to China. Not even 100 come to India, I'm sure of that. I happened to visit America just for personal reasons, and I have taught the Chinese students there. I've seen the Chinese in the best universities. Many of the departments, technical departments, especially like physics, mathematics, the difficult subjects, they tell me that their departments would close down if it were not for the Chinese or the Indian students going there. Americans don't want to do any of these difficult subjects. But there is one condition. The condition is the Chinese are looked after, they have so much money, they go around celebrating in these limousines, go for their dances, and you see them all over the place, in these big cities. But there is one condition, they have to go back to China, and in China they can't do what they want to do. They must go and teach in the universities. How many of our scholars come here to teach? They are all looking for packages in the corporate sector, which you also come from. They are not looking for any job, even though the teaching jobs have now become reasonably good. They're not as bad as they were when we started teaching on 200 rupees a month. That's a fact. That was my first salary check, 235. So that's how things have changed. But nobody wants to come and join or become a teacher. You ask the students who are poor. Nobody wants, it's not a glamorous job. What is your package? What do we do? It's not at all nice for them to do this. What I'm suggesting is the following. All of you, or most of you, are now in decision-making positions in the UGC, NITI, or whatever decision-making bodies are there, including the new education policy. I remember that we had these meetings, I think in Delhi School of Economics, Joan Robinson came, and she said, well, there are three things that are needed in education. One is history, the other is economic thought, and the third is faith. Now, and on that basis, we all learned Soviet economy, British economy, and Japanese economy. Then later on in the 70s, in the Bombay University, Bharadwaj, Brahmanand, all of you became part of a group who were revising the UGC syllabus. And we said, change these subjects now. And instead of Russian and British, we should teach Indian. You should learn Mandarin and not just merely not Russian. Or now the popular foreign languages are German or French, because that's where the jobs are. There are very few Mandarin departments. JNU is one such, but I think JNU is being downplayed these days for various reasons. So therefore my suggestion is, please change the syllabus. Include Chinese history as an essential part of undergraduate teaching. Instead of just doing Indian economic history or British history, we should teach them Chinese history, not only economic but Chinese history as a whole. And these little changes that we make in the syllabi, only then education. The students come to a foreign university, what do they go there? They do their own learning. The libraries are there, the teachers are there, they interact with each other and we learn. We've all done that when we've gone abroad. But we go there for the experience. When we go to a foreign university, you get an experience of various kinds. You meet people, you see things, you go to museums, you listen to music or whatever you're interested in. Where is that experience in any university campus in India? Tell me that. Only there, what you're saying, internal changes are needed, these are the tiny changes. Finally, I would give you one more example. You said export-led growth. I happen to, because during COVID times, all that you do is, okay, where do you go shopping, where do I do my groceries from? Amazon, of course. Now, of course, there are many more. And I was looking at it the other day. Guess what they are selling? You cannot guess. They are selling cow dung cakes, gobar cake, thapi. But then $8 ki or $5 ki. They are selling wood ash. Instead of detergent for cleaning dishes, they are selling bucketfuls of wood ash. You go and ask any exporter from here. Garments are exported. My husband was in that trade. The printing of fabrics, Sangareli printing, and the embroidery that we do here, it's been done in China. You buy the textile made in Bangladesh or Vietnam, it goes to China, they do all the work, and then it is again, manufactured here. You manufacture it here and you put a label here made in Bangladesh. Why? Because they get 15% discount. You get a label made in Vietnam because you get 15% discount because they know there's general preferences there. We don't get them anymore. So there are these little changes that have to be made. And copying the Chinese in export-led growth is going to lead to this kind of thing. Whatever they do, we can do better, of course. Look at the number of fires that take place in these high-rise buildings. It is because the wires that we are using, there is no standard check on that, no quality check on that, and any fire that takes place, short circuit होगा. कितने लोग डर गए क्या घर क्या कोई फर्क नहीं, short circuit is the answer. But what is a short circuit do? These are the little things. Thank you. Sorry for
about China you have done is really remarkable. For the first time I have had a good perception about China. Secondly, you made us to think about Mr. Raj Krishna when you said that it was impatient for Hindu rate of growth. This is another dimension we were not aware about. Now, I just